How long have you?
I start talking about Major Walker, since this is the house.
Yeah.
Uh, this house was built by Major Samuel Walker. Uh, he got the title. Uh, he was very briefly the superintendent of police, the Metropolitan Police, for slightly less than a year, I think. And it was obviously a job that he was not as well qualified for as he and some of his friends thought he was. He had already established, he was probably in his 40s at that point. This would have been back in the 1880s, 1886 I think it was. And he was already a very significant figure in Washington. For one thing, he represented the old Maryland families, and to a considerable degree, Washington then was still very much part of Maryland. Originally, though, they had taken territory from Virginia and Maryland district, but Virginia changed its mind and took its track, which is Alexandria, Virginia now. So was basically had all formerly been Maryland, and the Maryland people pretty much dominated, you could say, society and business and everything else. And the Walker family had been in Maryland for quite a long time, probably, well, supposedly the family story was that the original emigres had been followers of Bonnie Prince Charlie, and when he was badly defeated, they sort of fled for their lives and wound up around. Anyway, Major Walker was approached by what could be called the reform element, or I think the more popular expression once was the Goo-Goos, good government people. And they had the feeling that the police department was not functioning as well as it might, which was undoubtedly true. The basic problem with the police department then was that it was undermanned, and that it was very much controlled, as it was, by members of Congress. In other words, they felt that they really had to do what Congress told them. So this reform element, one of the commissioners, the city was run by commissioners, came to the major, and the major was, he wasn't a major when they came to him, but he was what could be called a leading Methodist layman all his life. He's a very religious man, and they came to him and said, you know, we'll appoint you superintendent and work with you to change the department. He accepted that. I suspect he was accepted as a sense of duty rather than as an opportunity to advance himself. At any rate, he lasted less than a year. The point, his point was to get a pure appropriation from Congress to hire more policemen. And as my interpretation, which is pretty close to the mark, he and this particular commissioner decided to blackmail the congressman, and they certainly wouldn't have called it blackmailing. But what they did was they set out to gather information on misbehaving congressmen. Mostly congressmen were going to houses in the red light district, which at that point was on the western foot of Capitol Hill, or what is now southwest Washington. And the major called in his chief officers, lieutenants, and captains, and in effect told them to keep your eyes open and the information on what, and these were significant congressmen, they were not just ordinary congressmen. Probably the Speaker of the House, although that isn't very clear from this. Well, it was a very, very grievous mistake because the word was passed around, and they had a trial, an in-house trial, or a police board trial, or the commissioners. The commissioners had a trial, on this particular lieutenant was charged with something like conduct unbecoming an officer, and that he had telling people that the major had ordered this information gathering process. Well, poor old major was on the witness stand. He was pretty frustrated, I guess. And he said, well, they talked about this subject at this meeting, but he denied vehemently that he had actually told them to get information. Pretty clear that that's the whole weight of the idea. And so they rounded up, as such things are often wound up, by firing the lieutenant who was conduct becoming an officer, and accepting the major's resignation. And he was mad at the commissioners and everybody else. He felt crossed. But that was his short career. However, he thought enough of it, he held on to the title for the rest of his life, which was a long life. So when I knew him, he was probably in his mid-80s. He died in 1935, I think it was, at the age of approximately 85, something like that. And he was, I remember very clearly, I must have been 2 or 3 years old. He was sitting on the side porch here, and my mother and I were walking down Fifth Street. And he beckons up, and he was a big figure. He had a long white beard, and he was sort of he was really the leading figure in the neighborhood, and was very much thought of and respected. He behaved in a very chill way to everybody, and I remember he was sitting there, and he shook my hand and patted me on the head. Said I was a fine-looking fellow, and he, as I say, that would have been, he died maybe a year or 2 later, and he had an enormous, naturally, not surprisingly, but the family, the Walker family, he had altogether 13 children, I think 1 or 2 of mine. The rest all grew to adulthood, and they were easily the first family, I would say, on Capitol Hill, certainly in the immediate neighborhood. However, they didn't fare that well. They didn't turn into rapscallions, but they were all getting into young adulthood as children, or not so young adulthood. And the Great Depression came, and that one daughter and her husband and children came back. They had been in Wyoming, involved in some kind of mining enterprise, and so they moved. He owned and he built and owned a house across the street, the big house there, and they moved in, and another daughter and her husband and their 2 children lived in this house on the 3rd floor. And another daughter, they had one boy, Max Smith was the boy's name. They moved in. So at one point, and Mrs. Hardy, his oldest daughter, who didn't come home, she just lived right on Fifth Street. He had built a big house for her when she was first married. So they all sort of settled in. And in a sense, the neighborhood and the country was undergoing a fairly subtle, not too subtle, changes. And this is my reconstruction of the past. And then obviously the past is a very elusive thing. But it had been a kind of a genteel, slightly what could roughly be called the lower upper class, the lesser gentry. There were a number of doctors in the neighborhood. In those days, doctors had their offices at home. And higher level civil servants, and a congressman or 2, and a superintendent of schools used to live up the block and so forth. And then the Depression came, and this hit the whole country very hard, and it hit, in a sense, it hit Washington and Capitol Hill less than any other place maybe. Because as the Depression got worse, the federal government got bigger. So the federal government was the major employer in the district. I don't even know who was in second place. Probably the printing industry, who printed government documents. So there was no real unemployment problem in Washington among the original people. And if the government was hiring, then people came from all over the country, excuse me, to get government jobs. And but the Depression, as I later learned, which the way it hit other places, it didn't hit here at all. And more or less in the middle of the Depression, for example, my father, who had been a automobile mechanic, and I'll say a very good one, he was never out of work for a moment, but my mother had saved their money and they bought a restaurant at 18th and L, and this would have been...
What was it called?
Hmm?
What was it called, the restaurant?
Just Kelly's, just called Kelly's. The original proprietor had the bad judgment to get a license in the name of the Nip and Sip Buffet, which, I don't know, it may attract some people, but I can't remember who they would be. Who would go to a place called a Nip and Sip Buffet? At any rate, the Kelly's, it worked well enough to to raise the children and get us to school. And of course, as is almost a stereotype, but there weren't that many Irish in Washington, and I suspect my father and mother knew most of them. I'm talking first or second generation Irish. And of my immediate relatives, and there were quite a few, lots of them owned bars, which is what the restaurant essentially was. My father opened it after they repealed Prohibition. But my uncle Bart Roddy, who lived on the other side of Stanton Park, had a bar, and my great aunt Nellie Folliard owned a bar, and my father's first cousin, Tom Flynn, owned a bar. So we were accustomed to owning bars. Seemed to be on a Sunday afternoon, my father and I would make a tour of the related bars, as it were, and say hello to the proprietor. They'd let me play the pinball machines free. Push a thing in the back where you didn't have to put nickels in. So this was the Depression boggled along nicely, and as I say, the hill had gradually changed. It was less dominated now by the people on what could be called a professional level. However, there were still, it wasn't go from, it remained a very respectable neighborhood. And there were still, for better or worse, lawyers and doctors around. But probably more of a shift in who, earlier the upper group dominated things. This was less so after the Depression. The neighborhood was always integrated. The word integrated was never used in the sense of the racial sense. There were always black families who were colored and likeness. It wasn't a term of denigration. It was a polite way that both black people, white people, black people as colored people. And some of them in the neighborhood are census and by and large they were poor people. And these phrases are very difficult because they weren't poor, they weren't taken like sharecropping farmers or something. But they lived, most of them lived in in the alleys, as they were called. Now, this was for various reasons, the alleys, which crisscrossed the blocks, had small four-room brick houses in them. And some of them were built originally for houses for the Irish who were working on the C&O Canal, digging it. but most of them moved on, and gradually the people lived in valleys. The alleys are now called courts, and they have become a nice little soul people or something. Middle-aged bachelors have a nice little home of their own, 4 rooms, which is nicely fixed up. So that is one thing that has changed strikingly. But as I say, there were always black people in the neighborhood. However, of course, the schools, and to a considerable degree, the lives were totally separate. The black children went to black schools, and I strongly suspect, I've never seen any accurate statistics or any other kind of statistics, but I suspect that almost the majority of the black kids did not go beyond a couple of grades of school. And they certainly didn't go to high school. There were 2 black high schools in the city. Of course, most white people didn't go to high school. This is where the things gets confused. Often when you talk about things like race, the person talking about it is either an advocate or a person of limited information. So you would say, for example, as I just said, very few black kids went to high school. Very, very few. On the other hand, you would not be as likely to know that very, very few white people went to high school. Most kids started working when they were, say, 16 years old. And there were, in both cases, there were relatively few high schools. You can tell by the name of the high schools as today. The first 3 high schools probably were Eastern, Western, and Central. That tells you a lot right there. And Eastern High School was first housed on the 3rd floor of what is now a junior high school. It didn't have a building of its own. And the number of people who went to college, of course, was very small. In fact, one of Major Walker's distinctions was that in his old age, he was the oldest living graduate of what is now George Washington University, which was originally called Columbia, I think, or Columbus College. And it was Methodist. It was a branch of the Methodist operations. So this is why history is so elusive. It's almost always told with somebody who is either telling a story or making a point. And it becomes much more black and white. I'm not referring to the racial tense, but the gray areas disappear, which is, I suppose, sad, if you will, because that's what the history is, gray areas. That's what it's all about. And so the heroes and villains did not appear to be particular heroes and villains when they were alive. That all emerges later on. At any rate, to get back to the house, the Major built this for his family, and probably around 1875, he built the part we're sitting in now. At that point, I assume he had relatively few children. And he was making money, but he would make more later. And he built this, and he prospered and had more children. So along about 1890 or so, he built the other half. And the other half, the wall down the middle of the house was formerly the outside brick